Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and tonight we're going to learn how to play the 1 to 4 player game Dizzle, being released by Stronghold Games. Dizzle comes with all of the components that you see here, including a block of player pads with 4 different difficulty levels, 13 dice, and 4 felt tip pins. To begin setup, all players will decide what level of difficulty they want to play. In our example, we'll be using level 1. After that, each player will receive a game sheet of the chosen level. Then, depending on the player count, a number of dice will be needed. In a 4-player game, all 13 dice will be used. In lower player counts, return any unused dice to the box. Then, each player should receive a felt-tipped pen, and you're ready to play. A game of Dizzle is played over a number of rounds depending on the player count. One round will consist of each player taking a full turn as the active player. During a player turn, the active player will roll all the dice. They'll then mark off the next round marker on their player sheet. They'll then arrange the dice in ascending order so that all players can clearly see the available values. After this, each player, beginning with the start player, will take turns in clockwise order, selecting one die at a time to place on their player sheet. So for instance, this player would select a die and place it on their player sheet, and then this player would select a die and place it on their player sheet, and it would continue in this way until either all of the dice are gone, or until each player has potentially dropped out of the turn. We'll look at how that happens in a moment. After all dice are selected or all players have dropped out, the turn would be over, and each player would be able to mark their sheet with an X where a die has been placed. Then, the next player in turn order would become the active player, roll all of the dice, and mark the next round in their player sheet. So as you can see, this player won't mark off round 1 until a full turn has been completed and they become the active player. After they mark off the round, they would then arrange the dice in ascending order, and the process of players drafting dice would begin again. When each player has had a chance to be the active player, the round will end. When drafting and placing a die on their turn, a player has to follow a few rules. The die has to be placed on a field that does not have an X. The die has to be placed on a field that matches its pip value. So for instance, with this 6, it could be placed on this field because the field shows a 6 and the field doesn't have an X on it. Each player has to put their first die orthogonally adjacent to a previously marked X space. At the start of the game, they'll have to start next to one of the pre-printed X spaces. Each die placed after a player's first die has to be orthogonally adjacent to a previously placed die. So for instance, a player could place this 5 right here if they wanted to, but they couldn't place it here because that's not orthogonally adjacent to the previously placed die. This will start to create a dice cluster. If possible, a player must take and place a die. It's possible due to how players place their dice for their current dice cluster to be completely closed in, either by X's, the edge of the player sheet, or locked spaces, which we'll look at the end of the video. If this happens, and only if this happens, a player is allowed to jump to another space and start a new dice cluster. To do this, a player would be allowed to place the next die they select next to any available field next to a marked out X. So for instance, the player could place a 4 right here because it's next to a marked out X. They still have to obey the pip rule matching the dice value to the sheet value. By doing this, a player would start a new dice cluster. It may also be possible that a player isn't blocked in, but isn't able to legally place a die during their dice selection step. This could be, for instance, a situation where none of the available dice match the pip value around a player's current dice cluster. In this instance, the player has one of 2 options. The first option that a player has is to drop out of the current turn. If they do this, they're no longer allowed to select and place any dice until the next player's turn. To indicate that a player has dropped out, they can simply place their pin on their player sheet. And then the next player in clockwise order would be able to select a die. The other option a player has in this situation will allow them to stay in the current turn, but it's risky. If a player can't legally place a die but doesn't want to drop out of the turn, they can roll again. When doing this, the player takes all of the remaining dice on the table, rolls them, and then they see if they can place a die from the new group of dice. In this instance, the player has rolled a 2 and a 6, both of which can be placed next to their dice cluster. Players are able to place these new dice on their sheet. In fact, if a player is able to place one of the newly rolled dice, they have to. If a player is unable to use any of the newly rolled dice, however, they have to take a previously placed die on their player sheet and return it to the pool as a penalty. The value of the returned die stays the same. If a player doesn't have any dice on their player sheet, they wouldn't have to return one as a penalty. The good news for the player is that if they decide to roll again, they are still in the turn whether they're able to place a die or not. So when it comes back to them to select a die, they get to make a selection again. They can also choose to roll again if they want to, or drop out if they want, assuming they're in the same situation of no legal dice placements on their next turn. It's also important to note that after a player rolls again, all of the rest of the players have to choose from this new pool of dice. If all of the players but one have dropped out of the round, the last remaining player has one more opportunity to choose a die. They can either choose a die or make the decision to drop out or roll again if this situation arises. Once this last active player makes their choice, the turn is over for everyone. As soon as a full turn is over, each player will draw X's on their fields that are covered with dice. Each player marks all fields covered with dice with an X. Some fields will have special effects, and we'll look at each of these fields in detail in a moment. The game will end after a set number of rounds has been completed based on the player count. Each player will count up points for special fields and subtract points for bombs and brown piles, which we'll look at in a moment. At the end of the game, players will add up all points for any of their fields with gemstones that are crossed off. Each field with a gemstone is worth 3 points at the end of the game. On the edge of some columns and rows, there are arrows with a number. At the end of the game, each completely crossed out row or column with an arrow provides the displayed number of points. So for instance, this column, if completed fully, would provide the player with 10 points. These points can be added in these sections here. There will also potentially be puzzle pieces on the player sheet. If a player has crossed off all of the puzzle pieces of the same color, they'll earn the corresponding amount of points denoted on the player sheet. In this instance, 10 points. There are also bomb spaces on the player sheet. The bomb field will cause a special effect at the end of the turn while players are marking X's. The player who's put the die on the bomb field puts a regular X on that field. All of the other players have to strike out the same bomb field on their game sheets with random lines, making the field explode. It is important to note, however, that if multiple players place a die on the same bomb field, both of those players get to cross out that field without causing it to explode. Any fields showing an explosion are worth -2 points at the end of the game. Some game sheets may also have lock symbols and key symbols on the game sheet. Before a player is able to put a die on a lock symbol, they have to place a die and cross out the corresponding key symbol. So for instance, if this player hadn't crossed out this color of key on the other side of the game sheet, they wouldn't be able to place a die on this lock sheet. Once a player crossed out a corresponding key that matches a color of lock, however, they would be able to place a die on that space later in the game. If a player reaches a flag field, they're able to cross off a number of points depending on who else has reached a flag. If a player is the first to reach a corresponding flag, they can circle the highest amount of victory points available. All other players would have to cross out this highest number. The second player to reach this flag later in the game would then be able to circle the next highest number, and all other players who had not reached that number yet would have to cross that out as well. If more than one player puts a die on a flag field at the end of the turn, all of those players get the respective number of points. The other players will cross out as many numbers as the players have reached flag fields. So for instance, if 2 players reached the flag at the same time, they would both circle the 10 victory points, and then the remaining 2 players would cross out the 10 and the 6. Only the 3 and the 1 would be available after that. On the level 4 sheet, there is a 4-square field that is framed by a black line. If all 4 fields are crossed out, a player gets 10 points. There's also special fields known as brown piles. These fields yield minus points at the end of the game if they're crossed out. It is possible that a player can remove dice from these fields during a turn due to a penalty. If this happens, the field is not crossed out. It's only crossed out when it's covered by a die at the end of the turn. There are also rockets and planets on some of the higher level sheets. A rocket will start at the end of the turn while placing an X on that field. The player who crosses out a rocket must immediately put one more X on a planet field of their choice. So for instance, if this player crossed off this rocket at the end of their turn, they would then immediately be able to cross out one of the planet fields on this game sheet. Alright everybody, that was our video. Thanks so much for watching. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email us directly at thedicey@gmail.com. If you want to hear more from the Dicey Review, you can check out the Dicey Review podcast. It can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, pretty much any podcasting app. You can read our written reviews at thediceyreview.com and make sure and connect with us on social media or at our Board Game Geek Guild. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you at the table.